Welcome back, listeners, to Dark Dialogue Distilled. If you're new here, this obviously is not the main show, and it's not meant to be. Distilled is where I slow things down and follow the questions that won't leave me alone. The things that bother me about a case, the details that just don't sit right, the evidence that didn't quite fit into a tightly structured episode, or the thoughts that came after the microphones were already off. This is the show where I get to be a little bit more fluid, a lot more direct, and a lot more honest about what I'm wrestling with. Sometimes that means revisiting a case that we've already covered. Sometimes it means digging into a specific piece of evidence. And sometimes it's just me working through something in real time, because that's how real analysis actually happens. Now, before we get into it, I do want to ask you to help this show out. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that thumbs up, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss future episodes. If you're listening on audio, please follow the show, leave a review, and share the episode with someone who cares about getting these cases right. These small actions matter more than people realize, especially for independent shows that aren't afraid to question official narratives. All right, so with that out of the way, let's get into what's been bothering me about the Holly Bobo case. So this is one of those episodes that's been sitting with me for a long time, because even when we covered the Holly Bobo case on the main show, back when we talked about the timeline, the investigation, the trial, all of it, I remember saying out loud that something about it didn't sit right with me. And that wasn't hindsight. I said that then. At that time, I didn't know exactly why. I just knew there were pieces that didn't line up cleanly. And I remember flagging that discomfort instead of trying to smooth it over. I didn't have an answer, just a feeling that the case worked harder than it should have to make everything fit. And now, here we are, all this time later, and that feeling still hasn't gone away. If anything, it's gotten louder. But before we go any further, let me do a quick reset for anyone who hasn't listened to the main show episode. I'm not going to retell the entire case here. We already did that in detail, but you do need the basic frame. So in April 2011, Holly Bobo disappeared from her family's home in rural Tennessee. There was an eyewitness. There was blood at the scene. There was an enormous investigation. Years later, multiple people were charged. One man, Zach Adams, was convicted and sentenced to life plus 50 years. Largely on the strength of eyewitness testimony rather than physical evidence. Now, that's the headline version. If you want the full story, the timeline, the family background, the trial narrative, I strongly recommend going back and listening to the main show episode. This episode is not meant to replace that, because this conversation isn't really about what happened then. It's about what's happening now. Over the last year, this case has shifted again. There's a post-conviction relief review underway. Key testimony has been recanted. Old evidence has been re-examined. And some of the same questions that were brushed aside years ago are suddenly impossible to ignore. So that's where Distilled comes in. This isn't me arguing innocence or guilt. It's not me trying to undo a verdict with a microphone. It's me doing what we do here on Distilled. Sitting down with you, the listeners, and talking through the things that just don't add up, the things that make me pause, the things that keep nagging at the back of my brain when a case is supposedly closed. Because when a case depends this heavily on narrative, when timelines strain, when technology pushes back, when witnesses change their stories, the right response is not certainty, it's scrutiny. This episode is going to stay high level by design. I want to walk through the pressure points in this case, the evidence conflicts, the testimony problems, the investigative decisions, without getting buried in charts and maps and timestamps. Those are coming. I'm currently working on a series of video deep dives where we'll actually show what I'm talking about. The cell data, the geography, timelines, all of it, piece by piece. Slowly and visually. That's where the heavy lifting belongs. But before we get there, I want to have this conversation first. Just you and me. No theatrics, no verdict shopping, Just an honest look at why this case never quite settled and why the questions around it are very much alive again. So let's start there. So at a high level, here's where we're at with the Holly Bobo case. This starts in April of 2011. In rural West Tennessee, Holly Bobo was a 20-year-old nursing student living at home while going to school. On the morning of April the 13th, she was studying for an exam, getting ready to leave for class, when something went very wrong. A neighbor heard a scream. Her brother saw her outside with a man in camouflage. Blood was found near her car, and then she was gone. What followed was one of the largest investigations in Tennessee history. Hundreds of volunteers. The TBI was brought in almost immediately. Tips pouring in from all over the country. Items believed to belong to Holly turning up along back roads and in creeks. But for years, there was no body, no arrest. Just a growing sense of pressure on investigators, on the community, on the family, to figure out what the hell happened. In 2014, Holly's remains were finally found in the woods near Interstate 40, and not long after that, the case shifted dramatically. A group of local men, all connected by drugs, petty crime, and long-standing reputations, were suddenly at the center of the investigation. Zach Adams, his brother Dylan, Jason Autry, and at least peripherally, Shane Austin. The state's theory was brutal and chaotic, that Holly had been abducted, raped, and murdered as part of a drug-fueled series of events involving multiple people, multiple locations, in a hurried attempt to cover it all up. By 2017, Zach Adams went to trial, and it's important to understand this part very clearly. There was no DNA tying Zach to Holly's murder, no video of the alleged rape, no physical evidence that definitively placed Holly at any of the locations that the state described. The case hinged on testimony. Most importantly, the testimony of Jason Autry, who cut a deal and told the jury a detailed story about how Holly was taken, where she was held, and how she was ultimately killed. The jury believed him. Zach Adams was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life without parole plus 50 years. Dylan Adams later took a plea. Autry served a much shorter sentence and was eventually released. Shane Austin tragically died by suicide before his role was ever fully resolved. So on paper, the case was closed, but almost immediately cracks began to show. Zach appealed his conviction. That appeal failed in 2022. The courts ruled that legally, the evidence was sufficient, even if it was circumstantial and testimony heavy. And then something happened that brought all of this back into question. After his release, Jason Autry recanted. Not casually, not offhand, but in recorded statements, in jail calls, and to professionals. He claimed that his trial testimony was false, that he'd built his story using discovery materials, that he was under enormous pressure, and that he did not actually know how Holly Bobo died. That recantation is now at the center of Zach Adams' post-conviction relief case. Over the last couple years, that case has been working its way through the courts. A full evidentiary hearing was held in May of 2025. Former investigators testified. Cell phone evidence was re-examined. Alternative theories, including the early focus on sex offender Terry Britt, were revisited in open court. Some evidence was allowed in, some evidence was excluded. Autry's recorded recantation itself was ruled inadmissible as hearsay, though the broader issues that it raised are still very much alive in this case. As of now, and this is why I wanted to do this podcast, the post-conviction judge has heard the evidence. The appeals on evidentiary rulings have wrapped up, and a decision is pending. That decision could come at any time. And depending on what the judge rules, this case could stay exactly where it is, or it could open back up in a very real way. So that's the landscape. A conviction that survived direct appeals, a key witness who has walked back his story, a body of evidence that has always been controversial, and a legal system that is not yet finished. What I want to do for the rest of this episode is not argue outcomes, but walk through why this case keeps resurfacing and why so many of the same questions refuse to go away, and why, even now, reasonable people can look at the same record and come to very different conclusions. So that's where we're headed next. This is where I always end up starting with this case. Not because eyewitness testimony is perfect, because it isn't, but because in this case, it's the one piece of information that existed before the investigation went anywhere else. Before suspects, before theories, before plea deals. On the morning Holly disappeared, there was exactly one person who saw the abductor, and that person was Holly's brother, Clint Bobo. And that description that he gave matters. Not because it's flawless, but because it's the only contemporaneous snapshot that we have of who was actually there. Clint described the man that he saw with Holly as being roughly 5'10" to 6 feet tall, around 200 pounds, with dark hair that was long enough to cover the back of his neck and collar. He also described a deep, raspy voice, something that stood out to him enough that he mentioned it. Now, let me be very clear about what I'm not saying here. I am not saying eyewitnesses can't be mistaken. I'm not saying that stress doesn't distort memory. And I'm not saying that description alone should decide a case. But what I am saying is this. When you later build a case around specific people, that original description doesn't just disappear. It either lines up or it doesn't. And in this case, it doesn't. So let's walk through that carefully. Zach Adams, the man who ultimately ends up convicted, was not 5'10" to 6 feet tall. He was over 6'2", closer to 6'3". And more importantly, at the time, he was extremely thin. Not lean, not athletic, but meth addict thin. Multiple accounts put him in the neighborhood of 135 pounds. That's not a small discrepancy. Height is one thing. People misjudge height all the time, but body type is different. A 200-pound man and a 135-pound man don't move the same way. They don't feel space the same way. They don't register the same visually, especially at close range. Next, we have Jason Autry. Now, Autry was described by people who knew him as huge, 6'6", give or take, a big man. And again, that's not a subtle miss. That's not confusing someone who's 6 feet with someone who's 6'1". That's a full freaking category difference. And then we have Dylan. Dylan Adams, Zach's brother, is sometimes treated as a closer physical match, but when you actually look at the description, that doesn't hold up either. Former TBI agent Terry Dykus described Dylan as, quote, rather tall, estimating him at around 6'1". He characterized Dylan as slender, not as extremely thin as Zach, but still lean, placing his weight at roughly 165 pounds. Now, at the time that Dykus observed him, Dylan had short, dark hair. That matters because none of that aligns with what Clint Bobo described. The eyewitness did not describe a tall, slender man. He described someone who was barrel-chested, a man around 200 pounds, with a heavier upper body and a presence that filled space. Again, height alone doesn't disqualify someone, but body composition does. A lean 165-pound man does not register the same way as a barrel-chested 200-pound man at close range. And once more, the description does not bend to fit the suspect. It simply does not match. And then there's Shane Austin. Austin's height and build were close to the range that Clint gave, but the hair doesn't match. Clint described dark hair long enough to cover the neck. Austin had short red hair. That's not lighting. That's not angle. That's just not the same damn thing. And that brings us to Terry Britt. Now, I want to be careful here because this is where people tend to think you're pointing a finger. Well, that's not what I'm doing. What I'm doing is comparing descriptions. Britt was about 6 feet tall, around 200 pounds, dark hair, and critically, he had a deep, raspy smoker's voice. That detail matters because voices are often more memorable than faces, especially when you don't see someone clearly. On paper, Britt matches the description in a way that the others just simply do not. That doesn't make him guilty, but it does make him consistent. And here's the part that has always bothered me. As the case moved forward, the description didn't evolve to better fit the new evidence. Instead, the evidence was increasingly asked to bend around the people that the state focused on. That's bass-ackwards. Descriptions should be tested against suspects, not quietly deprioritized when they don't cooperate. And again, this doesn't mean that Clint was right about everything. Trauma affects perception. Memory is imperfect. I get all of that. But when your only eyewitness gives you a description that consistently points away from the people that you prosecute and towards someone that you ultimately set aside, well, that's not something you just shrug off. It's something that you interrogate, because once you start explaining why the description doesn't matter, you've already decided who matters more, and that's a theme we're going to keep coming back to. So if the eyewitness description doesn't cleanly line up with the people who were ultimately prosecuted, the next obvious question is, okay, then where's the physical evidence? Because this wasn't a cold case that went unsolved for decades. This was a massive, immediate investigation with resources, manpower, and time. And investigators didn't just search once. They searched repeatedly. Homes, vehicles, outbuildings, trailers, garages, the properties that were connected to Zach Adams, to Dylan Adams, to Jason Autry, and to Shane Austin were gone over again and again. After all of that, there was no DNA linking Holly Bobo to any of them. No fingerprints. No blood conclusively tying her to those locations. No biological evidence that puts Holly inside the places that the state later described in court. Now, I want to pause here because this is where people tend to jump to extremes. A lack of physical evidence does not automatically mean that someone is innocent. Crimes happen without leaving clean forensic trails, and it happens all the time. But what it does mean is that the case has to lean more heavily on something else. Testimony, timelines, circumstantial inference. And when that happens, the physical evidence that does exist becomes even more important, which brings us back again to Terry Britt. During the investigation into Terry Britt, his van was searched, and inside that van, investigators found a hair that was microscopically consistent with Holly Bobo's. That phrase matters. So let me unpack it just a little bit. Microscopically consistent. It does not mean a DNA match. It means that under a microscope, the hair shared characteristics that were consistent with Holly's color, structure, and other traits. But testing could not definitively confirm that it belonged to her. So no, that hair is not a slam dunk. But here's the problem. It's also not nothing, especially when you compare it to the complete absence of comparable physical evidence tied to the men who were ultimately charged and convicted. And this is where the imbalance starts to show. On one side, you have multiple suspects searched repeatedly with no biological link to Holly. On the other, you have a man who matches the eyewitness description, lived nearby, had a history of violent sexual offenses, and whose vehicle contained a hair that at least could not be ruled out as Holly's. That should have raised the volume on that lead, not lowered it. Instead, as the investigators moved forward, the physical finding became something that was acknowledged and then quietly sidelined. Again, I'm not saying that one hair proves anything, but when your case against one group of people has no physical anchor at all and a different suspect does, that's not a detail that you minimize. That's a detail that you should stress test, because physical evidence doesn't bend to narratives. It doesn't change its mind. It doesn't negotiate plea deals. It either connects or it doesn't. And in this case, the physical evidence problem never got solved. It just got worked around, which forces the case to lean even harder on stories that, as we're going to see, start to strain when you put them on the timeline. So when you get past the eyewitness problems and the lack of physical evidence, the case leans heavily on timing. Who was where? When were they there? And whether the story the state told can actually move through real space in real time. This is where things stop being subjective. Phones don't care about reputations. They don't care about plea deals. They don't care what story makes sense emotionally. They either connect to a tower or they don't. And according to multiple expert analysis, the phones in this case were not where the state needed them to be. So let's start with Zach Adams. On the morning Holly disappeared, Zach's phone actively places him on his home tower, the Cox Road or truck stop tower, during critical windows when, according to the state, he should have been somewhere else entirely. At the same time, Holly's phone was moving north, not drifting, not bouncing around randomly, moving. Her phone activity shows a progression toward the Shiloh Road Tower, away from her home, and away from where the state later claimed that she was taken first. Those two paths don't intersect. For the state's version of events to work, Zach and Holly would have had to have been together during that window. But the phones say they weren't. So now let's add Jason Autry. Autry's phone was pinging north in Benton County near Camden early that same morning. And this is important because Autry's trial testimony placed him at the center of the crime almost immediately after the abduction. If his phone is already north, he cannot also be south, near the Bobo home at the same time. There's no interpretation trick that fixes that. There's no maybe he turned it off explanation that fits that data. There's no overlap. And this isn't a case of one stray ping or a fuzzy margin of error. This is directionally wrong. What bothers me about this part of the case is not that cell phone evidence is complicated. It is. And it can be misread. I've said that many times. But what bothers me is that the conflicts here don't create ambiguity. They create impossibility. The story requires people to be in two places at once. It requires phones to follow paths that their owners didn't follow. It requires movement that doesn't align with geography. And instead of forcing a reevaluation of the narrative, the timeline was treated as something flexible, something that could be adjusted just enough to make the story survive. But time doesn't work that way. When a case depends this heavily on testimony, the timeline is supposed to anchor it. In this case, the timeline does the opposite. It pulls it apart. And that's before you even factor in travel times. Because once you start asking how fast people would have had to have moved to make this all work, it stops being about interpretation and it starts being about physics. So let's say, just for the sake of argument, that you ignore everything that I've already talked about. Ignore the eyewitness mismatch. Ignore the lack of physical evidence. Ignore the fact that the phones aren't lining up cleanly. Let's just assume the story is basically true and ask a very simple question. How fast would they have to move? This is where former TBI investigator Terry Dicus comes in. Dicus didn't come to this case as an outsider or as an advocate. He was one of the lead investigators early on, and he was the one tasked with pressure testing the timelines. Not theories, not motives, but whether the movements people were describing were even possible. When he analyzed Jason Autry's testimony about where they went and when, particularly the claim that Holly's body was transported and disposed of under a bridge near the Tennessee River, the numbers didn't just come out tight, they came out absurd. For Autry's version of events to work, when you line up the cell phone activity, the distances involved, and the known times, the travel speed required would have exceeded 1,200 miles per hour. Let me say that again, because it's easy to assume that that's hyperbole. Over 1,200 miles per hour. That's not a margin of error problem. That's not a maybe the phone pinged late kind of problem. And that's not traffic was light. That's faster than a fighter jet. And this isn't a number pulled out of thin air. It comes from basic math. Distance divided by time. When you compress those distances into the windows that the phones allow, the speed required stops being humanly possible. And what's striking to me isn't just that the math doesn't work, it's that it can't be made to work. You can shift starting points. You can fudge endpoints. You can argue over which tower mattered most. And no matter how you slice it, the timeline still demands movement that simply cannot happen on rural Tennessee roads. At that point, you're not dealing with a weak timeline. You're dealing with a timeline that violates reality. And here's the part that I just can't get past. When a timeline collapses this completely, you have two choices. You can either question the testimony that requires it, or you decide that the testimony is untouchable and force everything else to bend around it. In this case, the second option won. The story survived, but only because the math was treated as an inconvenience instead of a veto. And once you cross that line, you're no longer asking what happened. You're defending what's already been decided. So far, a lot of what we've talked about lives in the realm of analysis. Cell towers, ping windows, travel calculations. And I know that for some people, that all still feels a little theoretical, like something that you can argue with if you really want to. But this next piece is not theoretical. It's a clock. During the post-conviction review case, investigators uncovered a bank ATM video from Parsons. The footage shows a truck matching Dylan Adams' vehicle at an ATM at 11:12 a.m. on the morning that Holly disappeared. That time matters because, according to the state's theory at trial, the defendants were still in the process of transporting and disposing of Holly's body during that window. Now, those two things cannot be true. If the truck is in Parsons at 11:12, it cannot also be somewhere else under a bridge near the river doing what the state claimed was happening at that time. There's no wiggle room here. ATMs do not estimate time. They don't rely on memory. They don't get confused under pressure. They timestamp transactions. And what's especially troubling about this is not just that the video exists, it's that it was not meaningfully addressed during the original trial. Instead, it surfaced later, buried in massive volumes of digital material, labeled in a way that didn't exactly draw attention to what it was. Again, I'm not telling you what conclusion to draw, but I am saying that when you have a fixed, independently timestamped piece of evidence that contradicts a central part of the prosecution's timeline, that's not something that you just explain away. It's something that you confront head on. And at some point, you have to ask whether that story was ever grounded in the real world to begin with, or whether it survived because nothing was allowed to knock it down. Up to this point, everything that we've talked about lives outside of people's heads. Descriptions, physical evidence, phones, distances, a timestamp video. All of that exists whether anyone tells the truth or not. But the state's case didn't live or die on data. It lived or died on one person, Jason Autry. At trial, Autry was the spine of the prosecution's narrative. His testimony didn't just fill in gaps. It was the story. The locations, the sequence, the violence, the disposal, almost everything the jury needed to visualize what happened came through him. And for years, that testimony was treated as settled fact until it wasn't. In 2024, Jason Autry recanted his trial testimony, not partially, not selectively, all of it. According to Autry, the story that he told the jury wasn't something that he remembered. It was something that he built. He admitted that while sitting in jail, facing the very real possibility of a life sentence, he fabricated the narrative using discovery materials. He studied what investigators already believed, what evidence they had, and what details were publicly known. And then he constructed a version of events that fit. His words, and this matters, were that he, quote, added Holly to a day that he had actually spent doing drugs. That line should stop you because it reframes everything. If that's true, then the story wasn't a confession. It was a survival strategy, a way to trade information for freedom, a way to become useful. And here's the uncomfortable part. Nothing about that incentive structure is unusual. Jailhouse testimony has always been one of the most fragile forms of evidence that we have. It's negotiated, it's motivated, and it often comes from people who already know the system rewards cooperation, not accuracy. What makes this different is not that Autry later changed his story. It's that his original story already required everything else to bend to accommodate it. Remember what we just walked through. The phones didn't line up. The timeline didn't work. The travel was impossible. The ATM video contradicted key moments. And instead of those contradictions undermining Autry's testimony, they were explained away because of it. That's the inversion. Now, to be clear, recantations are messy. Courts hate them. Judges are right to be skeptical, especially when someone has already benefited from a deal. But skepticism cuts both ways. If a conviction depends on testimony that collapses the moment it's no longer incentivized, testimony that required physics-defying timelines and ignored contradictory data, then at the very least, the foundation needs to be re-examined. And that's where this case is right now. The courts may ultimately decide that Autry's recantation doesn't meet the legal standard for relief, that it's a separate question. But from an evidentiary standpoint, from a truth-seeking standpoint, this is not a small crack. This is the beam that the house was built on, saying, I was never real to begin with. So if Jason Autry's testimony raises questions about incentive and self-preservation, Dylan Adams' confession raises a very different and arguably more troubling issue: capacity. From the beginning, Dylan was described as having significant learning disabilities. Multiple people who knew him characterized him as highly suggestible, someone who wanted to please authority figures, who struggled with abstract thinking, and who had difficulty understanding long-term consequences. That matters not morally, structurally, because the criminal justice system is not built for people like that. When Dylan was interrogated, he wasn't just another suspect being questioned. He was someone with limited cognitive defenses being pulled into an already forming narrative. And what he said reflects that. Dylan claimed that Holly was raped at Zach's house. That alone should have raised immediate red flags because it directly contradicted Jason Autry's story, which placed the sexual assault elsewhere, tied to a river disposal scenario. Those aren't minor discrepancies. Those are mutually exclusive accounts. You don't fix that with memory fade. You fix it by deciding which story you want to believe. But The problems didn't stop there. Recordings later revealed that Dylan was not simply confessing, he was being coached. Dennis Benjamin, a private investigator working with the Bobo family, was recorded guiding Dylan, shaping his responses, and critically, threatening him with the death penalty if he didn't cooperate. Once the death penalty enters the room, the dynamic changes completely, especially for someone with limited cognitive ability. At that point, you're no longer asking someone to tell the truth. You're asking them to survive. And survival often looks like agreement. The details Dylan provided reflect that pressure. He got basic facts wrong. He described Holly as having a small cut on her lip, a detail that doesn't match the physical evidence from the carport, which showed signs of a much more violent struggle involving pretty significant blood. That's not a memory slip. That's a constructed image. When confessions are reliable, they tend to include details that investigators didn't know yet, things that later turn out to be true. When they're unreliable, they're vague, contradictory, or wrong in ways that suggest guessing or prompting. Dylan's statements fall squarely into that second category. And here's the part that's hardest to sit with. Once Dylan's confession existed, it became corroboration for Autry's story and vice versa, even though the two accounts didn't actually match. Instead of one story checking the other, they were used to prop each other up. That's how fragile narratives gain weight. And again, this is not about saying that Dylan was innocent or guilty. It's about recognizing that his statements were produced under conditions that make reliability extremely difficult to defend. When you combine suggestibility, authority pressure, and the threat of death, what you get isn't truth. You get compliance. And when a case relies on that kind of compliance to hold together, it stops being about evidence and it starts being about momentum. Before I get into this next part, I want to say something plainly. I have spent countless hours digging into the cell phone data in this case, not just reading about it, but actually laying it out, mapping it, stepping through it minute by minute. And I'm doing that right now as part of a video episode that dives deeply into this evidence because it is extremely hard to grasp what's wrong here without being able to see it. When you see the maps, when you see the towers, when you see the movement plotted over time, the discrepancies don't just stand out. They become unavoidable. That said, I don't want to hand wave this by saying, just trust me. So I'm going to do my best to explain it clearly in audio, knowing that this is one of those moments where visuals really matter. So let's start with Holly Bobo's phone, because regardless of what anyone says happened that morning, her phone tells a very specific story. Experts who analyzed the data established that Holly's phone followed what's been described as a clockwise route on the morning of April the 13th, 2011. And that phrase isn't metaphorical, it's literal. So here's the sequence. Around 8 a.m., Holly's phone leaves the area of the Bobo residence. That area is serviced by what's commonly referred to as the Chesterfield Tower, essentially the home tower for that location. From there, the phone travels north. At 8:17 a.m. and again at 8:26 a.m., Holly's phone is active on the Shiloh Road Tower. That's important because it shows sustained presence in that northern direction, not a quick bounce, not a stray ping, but a continued activity. After that, the phone continues moving, this time a bit east. At 9:06, the phone is active on the truck stop or Cox Road Tower. And finally, the phone turns south, where its last known activity occurs at 9:25 a.m. After that, the phone goes silent. So when people describe this as a clockwise route, this is what they mean. From her home north, north to the east, east to the south, a loop. And that's what matters. And what matters here isn't just the path, it's the order. The phone doesn't zigzag. It doesn't double back. It doesn't bounce randomly between towers. It moves in a deliberate directional progression. Now, here's why this is such a problem for the state's case. The prosecution narrative required Holly to be taken to specific locations, barns, trailers, river sites, in a sequence that simply does not align with this movement. To make their story work, you would need the phone to either jump backwards in time, move in opposite directions simultaneously, or pause in places where the data shows it clearly did not pause. And it doesn't do any of those things. Instead, it follows a clean, consistent path, one that makes sense geographically, but not narratively. And this is one of those moments where once you really understand it, once you see it, you can't unsee it, because the phone is not reacting to testimony. It isn't adjusting to confessions. It isn't filling in gaps. It's just being a phone. It's just moving. And the movement does not support the story that the jury was told. Now that you understand the path Holly's phone took, the next question is obvious. If Zach Adams was with Holly, if he abducted her, transported her, and controlled where she went, then his phone should be moving with hers. It doesn't. In fact, the data shows the exact opposite. While Holly's phone was traveling north and actively communicating with the Shiloh Road Tower, including activity at 8:26 a.m., Zach Adams' phone was somewhere else entirely. During that same window, Zach's phone was active on what's considered his home tower, Truck Stop or Cox Road Tower, Sector 2. And it wasn't a single stray hit. Zach's phone was communicating repeatedly at 8:19, 8:30, 8:35, 8:38, including communication with Jason Autry. So while Holly's phone is moving north, moving along that clockwise route, Zach's phone is stationary enough to repeatedly hit the same tower sector. That matters because expert testimony established that the Shiloh Road Tower and the Truck Stop Tower are roughly 10 to 15 miles apart. In rural West Tennessee, that's not a quick hop. It's not a missed turn. It's not something that you bridge in a couple of minutes. To be clear, this isn't about exact GPS coordinates. It's about non-overlap. Expert witness John Reeves testified plainly that the two devices were not together at the same location at the same time during the critical morning window. Probably not hard to say, not within a margin. They were not together. And this is where the state's theory runs into a wall. For the prosecution's version of events to work, Zach Adams has to be physically with Holly during this period. He has to be the one controlling her movement. But the phones don't support that at all. Instead, what you see is separation. Holly's phone is moving, Zach's phone is not. And there is no moment in the data where those two paths converge. I want to slow this down for a second because this is one of those details that gets waved away too easily. This isn't about whether phones always perfectly track people, because they don't. And we know that they were working on 2G technology, so even less reliable than the 5G that we have today. But this is about consistency. Zach's phone shows repeated, clustered activity in one area. Holly's phone shows directional movement somewhere else completely. Those two realities can't both be true if Zach is with Holly. You don't fix that by saying, well, maybe he left his phone behind, because the state never argued that. They never proved it. And it doesn't fit with the volume of communication happening during that window. Once again, the case asks you to accept that the data is a misunderstanding, not occasionally, but precisely when it matters the very most. And when the evidence keeps requiring that kind of exception, it stops being coincidence and it becomes pattern. So now we've talked about Holly's phone. We've talked about Zach's phone. The last piece of the puzzle is Jason Autry's phone, the same person whose testimony the entire case ultimately leaned on. And this is where things really start to unravel. According to Autry's own testimony at trial, he was involved early. He placed himself in the middle of the events of that morning, present for key moments, present for transport, present for murder, present for disposal. But his phone doesn't agree with him. At 6:50 a.m., Jason Autry's phone was located north in Benton County near Camden. That's not near the Bobo home. That's not near Swan Johnson Road. That's not on the way. It's a different county in the opposite direction. So right out of the gate, Autry is starting his day far from where the abduction actually occurred. Then, later that morning, between 8:19 and 8:55, Autry's phone is active on the truck stop or Cox Road Tower, and this part is subtle, but it's important. That tower actively is consistent with Autry being near Zach Adams' home or nearby areas. What it is not consistent with is Autry being at the Bobo residence, at the abduction site, or at the river disposal location during that same time frame. In other words, even when Autry's phone is closer to Zach's general area, it still isn't where Autry claimed that he was, doing what he claimed that he was doing. And just like with Zach's phone, this isn't a one-off ping. It's sustained activity, repeated hits on the same tower over a meaningful window of time, which brings us to the most damning part of this from an evidentiary standpoint. Expert Jonathan Reeves testified that there was no correlation between Jason Autry's device and Holly Bobo's device at any time that morning. None. No overlap, no convergence, no shared location at any point. And that matters because Autry's testimony requires him to be physically with Holly, not just once, but repeatedly as events unfold. But the phones never put them together. Not early, not later, not ever. So now step back and look at what we've just walked through. Holly's phone moves in a deliberate clockwise route. Zach's phone stays put and never joins it. Autry's phone starts far away and never intersects either. 3 phones, 3 independent data sets, 0 points of convergence. At that point, you're not looking at a confusing picture. You're looking at a very clear one, and the clarity doesn't support the story that won the conviction. By the time investigator Terry Dicus sat down to do his timing analysis, this case had already accumulated more contradictions than it should have survived. So Dicus did the one thing that cuts through the argument. He timed it, not based on theory, not based on what someone said happened, based on what the phones recorded and what the roads actually allow. He took Jason Autry's trial testimony, specifically the claim about where they were, where they went, and how quickly they regrouped afterward, and he laid it over the cell phone ping data. And the result wasn't just problematic, it was impossible. According to Autry, after the final phone activity associated with Holly, there was a sequence of movements that placed the group back at Shane Austin's residence in a very tight window. When Dicus calculated what that would require, the distance between those locations and the amount of time available The speed needed to make it work came out to 1,227 miles an hour on rural Tennessee roads. That number isn't rhetorical. It's not an estimate meant to shock. It's the mathematical consequence of trying to force Autry's testimony to fit the data. And once you reach that point, there is no interpretative tricks that are left. You can argue about tower ranges. You can argue about phone usage habits. You can argue about memory. You can't argue with arithmetic because the math isn't even close. It doesn't come out in an 80 mile an hour answer. It doesn't come in at 100 miles an hour. It doesn't even come in at 200 miles an hour. It comes in faster than a jet, which means the problem isn't that the timeline is tight. The problem is that the timeline does not exist in the real world. And here's what keeps pulling me back to this. When investigators encounter a timeline that demands the impossible, that's supposed to be the end of that version of events. You don't adjust it. You don't contextualize it. You don't ask a jury to overlook it. But in this case, the timeline was preserved. And not because it worked, but because too much of the case depended on it working. Once again, the evidence didn't fail. The story did. One of the most vivid parts of Jason Autry's testimony, and one of the parts the jury likely remembered the most, was the claim that Holly's body was taken to the Tennessee River. It's concrete. It's visual. It gives the story an ending point. The problem is the phones don't get there when the story says they do. According to Autry, the river was part of the early sequence, tied closely to the disposal of the body. That claim only works if Zach Adams and Jason Autry's phone are near the river during the same window when Holly's phone activity ends. They aren't. The area of the Tennessee River relevant to Autry's testimony is covered by the Birdsong Tower, specifically Sector 7. And here's what the data shows. Zach Adams' phone does not reach the Birdsong Tower until 9:42. Jason Autry's phone does not reach it until 9:50. By that time, Holly Bobo's phone had already stopped moving near the Gooch Creek area. More than 15 minutes later. That sequence matters because if the river disposal happened when Autry said it did, the phone should converge there before or as Holly's phone activity ends. They don't. Instead, what you see is this. Holly's phone completes its clockwise movement and goes silent near the Shiloh Road Tower in Gooch Creek. Only later do Zach's and Autry's phones appear in the river tower's coverage area. That's not a delay that you can smooth over. It means the river cannot be where Holly was when her phone last moved. And that has consequences because if the river isn't the end point, if it comes after, then Autry's story isn't just off by a little. It's totally out of order. And when a timeline depends on a dramatic endpoint like a river, but the data shows the endpoint happens later, you're left with a gap that testimony can't fill. And once again, the phones are doing the same thing they've been doing all along. They're not contradicting each other. They're not bouncing randomly. They're not creating confusion. They're quietly refusing to support the story. And at this point, that refusal is consistent across every critical moment, which brings us to the hard question, not a legal one, but a logical one. If Holly's phone stopped moving near Shiloh Road and Gooch Creek, and if the river comes later, then what actually happened in between? That's not something testimony has ever answered. And it's not something that the timeline allows you to ignore. There's one more phone that we haven't talked about yet, and it's worth addressing, not because it solves anything, but because of how often it's been used to suggest something that it doesn't actually prove. Shane Austin's phone. According to the records, Shane Austin's phone shows no activity at all from early morning until 9:23 a.m. No texts, no calls, no data, no nothing. And that silence has been used implicitly and sometimes explicitly to keep him inside the narrative, as if the lack of phone activity somehow supports the idea that he was involved. But silence isn't evidence. All it really tells us is that we don't know where Shane Austin was during that window. It doesn't place him at the Bobo residence. It doesn't place him at a barn. It doesn't place him at the river. And it doesn't place him with Holly. At the same time, it doesn't provide an alibi. It's blank. And blanks are dangerous because they invite people to project meaning onto them. But here's what matters. When you look at the rest of the phones in this case, Holly's, Zach's, Jason's, they all do something. They move, they connect, they establish presence or absence. Holly's phone moves north. Jason's phone stays north, never intersecting with Holly's. Zach's phone, mostly around his home until he goes out to the Birdsong Tower and does drugs with Jason Autry, which is what his story said. Shane's phone does none of that during the most critical window. So what you're left with is not corroboration, but uncertainty. And uncertainty cannot be used to prop up a story that already depends on impossible timelines and contradictory testimony. In fact, if anything, Shane Austin's phone activity highlights the weakness of the case, because when the data is there, it consistently contradicts the narrative. And when it is not there, it gets treated as if it somehow helps. That's not how evidence works. Silence doesn't confirm a theory. It doesn't fill gaps. And it certainly doesn't validate testimony that can't stand on its own. At best, Shane Austin's phone tells us nothing. And when you step back and look at the full picture, 4 phones, 4 different stories, 0 convergence, the problem becomes impossible to ignore. This case doesn't suffer from missing data. It suffers from data that refuses to cooperate with the story. There's one final timing detail involving Shane Austin that tends to get lost in all of this, probably because it doesn't fit cleanly into the narrative that the jury heard. At 11:15 a.m., cell phone records place Shane Austin in Parsons. That's not an estimate. That's not inference. That's location data. And that placement lines up with something else that's hard to argue with. Bank records show Shane Austin using an ATM in Parsons around that same time. Those two things, phone data and bank records, corroborate each other, which means Shane Austin is documented as being in town, conducting a routine transaction during a window when the state's theory still had him involved in disposing of Holly's body. Those two realities cannot coexist. If Shane is in Parsons at the ATM, he is not somewhere else carrying out a body disposal. There's no interpretation issue here. No tower range debate. No memory problem. It's simply place and time. And this matters because the state's narrative didn't just require Shane Austin to be involved. It required him to be involved then. Once you remove him from that window, the already fragile timeline collapses even further. So now look at where we are. Earlier, Shane's phone tells us nothing when the abduction occurs. Later, it tells us something very specific, and that specificity contradicts the story, which means that at no point does Shane Austin's phone actually support the prosecution's version of events. It either offers no data or data that undermines the narrative. And at some point, you have to stop calling that coincidence, because when multiple independent records, phone logs, and bank transactions line up against the same claim, They're not doing what evidence is supposed to do. They're telling you what didn't happen. Now, up to this point, you could still hear the pushback some people raise. Well, that's the defense's interpretation. That's one expert's opinion. Cell data can be read different ways. Okay, fair enough. So let's talk about what happened when the state's own expert was asked to walk through the data. TBI agent Michael Frizzell testified about the cell tower evidence. And to his credit, he was cautious, measured. He didn't overstate things. He didn't try to dramatize the data. But on cross-examination, something important happened. When Frizzell was asked to describe the directional movement shown by the cell tower records, not theory, not the conclusion, just the movement, he agreed with what the data showed. North, then east, then south. That's important because that directional path aligns directly with the defense's theory and with the map created by U.S. Marshal John Walker. The same map that showed Holly's phone moving in a clockwise route, ending near Shiloh Road and Gooch Creek. This wasn't Frizzell endorsing the defense's narrative. It wasn't him accusing anyone. It was simply an acknowledgement that the phone didn't move randomly. It moved directionally. And once that's on the record, the debate changes because now you're not talking about competing interpretations anymore. You're talking about a shared factual baseline. Everyone agrees on the movement. The disagreement is over what to do with it. The prosecution needed that movement to be flexible, something that could be bent to fit testimony about barns and river crossings and regrouping points. But the data doesn't bend. It goes north, then east, then south. And when even the state's own witness concedes that basic fact, it undercuts the idea that this is all just speculative or defense-driven spin. At that point, the evidence is not controversial. It's inconvenient. And inconvenient evidence has a way of revealing where a case is being held together by proof and where it's being held together by insistence. There's one more expert voice that you have to hear in this conversation because it ties everything that we've talked about together in the simplest possible way. And that's U.S. Marshal John Walker. Walker wasn't theorizing. He wasn't speculating. He wasn't trying to sell a counter narrative. His job was to look at the cell data and ask a very basic question. Where did the phone actually go? And his answer was blunt. He testified that the route was, quote, real clear. According to Walker, if Holly's phone had deviated even slightly to go where the state claimed, to Zach Adams' house during the abduction or down towards the river, the phone would have hit different towers. Specifically, it would have registered on towers like Yuma or Parsons earlier that morning. It didn't. Not once. Cell phones don't politely avoid towers. They don't skip coverage areas out of loyalty to a narrative. If they pass through an area, they register it. Walker explained that the phone did exactly what you'd expect if it followed a direct route. It moved north, then east, then south, and it went straight to the freeway. Not to a house, not to a barn, not to the river, to the freeway corridor where Holly's remains were ultimately found. And that conclusion matters because it isn't about tower theory or signal strength or margin of error. It's about geography. If the phone had gone where the prosecution said that it went, the infrastructure would have recorded it. Different towers would have lit up. Different sectors would have engaged. They didn't. Instead, every step of the way, the phone behaved as if it were being moved along a clean, uninterrupted route, one that bypassed the locations central to the state's case and ended near the area where Holly was eventually discovered. That's not coincidence, And when you put Walker's testimony next to Frizzle's concession, north, east, south, the picture becomes very hard to ignore. At that point, this isn't about whose expert you trust more. It's about the fact that the phone never went where it was supposed to go, and no amount of testimony can make a device take a road that it didn't take. So, after walking through all of that, the phones, the timeline, the testimony, the obvious question is, okay, so what's actually happening with this case right now? Because this isn't academic. This isn't a closed book we're just arguing about years later. Zach Adams' case is actively in post-conviction relief review, and that process has unfolded in two major phases so far. The first was in May of 2025. That's when the court held a full evidentiary hearing. 4 days of testimony in Hardin County Circuit Court in front of Judge Brent Bradbury. This wasn't a motion hearing. This wasn't lawyers arguing in the abstract. This was witnesses, experts, former investigators, prosecutors. The defense came in with a second amended petition that raises 3 broad categories of claims. First, new evidence and actual innocence, centered largely around Jason Autry's recantation and the cell phone data that never fit his story. Second, ineffective assistance of counsel, the argument that Zach's trial attorneys didn't fully or effectively present alternative suspects, cell tower modeling, or impeachment of key witnesses. And third, due process and investigative issues, including tunnel vision and the way evidence pointed away from the state's theory was handled. Now, one of the biggest fights during the May hearing was over Jason Autry's recantation. The defense wanted to introduce a video statement Autry gave in December of 2022, where he said outright that he lied at trial, that he built his story from discovery materials and didn't actually know how Holly Bobo died. The state moved to keep that recording out, and Judge Bradbury agreed with them. He ruled that the recording itself was inadmissible, largely because it wasn't under oath, it didn't expose Autry to new criminal liability, and it didn't meet the standard for a hearsay exception. The ruling became its own legal issue. The judge certified it for interlocutory appeal, meaning the case paused while the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals reviewed that one evidentiary decision. In August of 2025, the appellate court affirmed the ruling. They didn't say Autry was telling the truth or that he was lying. They just said the trial court didn't abuse its discretion in excluding the recording. That's an important distinction because even without that video, the May hearing still included live testimony and documentary evidence attacking Autry's credibility, his timeline, and the feasibility of his story. After that appeal wrapped up, the case came back to Judge Bradbury for what was described as a final phase in December of 2025. That phase included final witnesses and closing arguments. Court TV and local outlets covered it as the point where the evidentiary record officially closed. At the end of that phase, Judge Bradbury stated on the record that he would take the matter under advisement and issue a written ruling, potentially within 60 days, possibly longer given the complexity of the case. And that's where things stand now. As of early 2026, the record is closed. The arguments are in. The appellate detour is over. The only thing left is the judge's decision. That decision could grant Zach Adams a new trial. It could grant some narrower form of relief, or it could deny the petition outright. And until that ruling is issued, everybody involved, the family, the defense, the state, and anyone watching this case is in a holding pattern, which is why I wanted to do this episode now. Because regardless of how the court ultimately rules, the evidence that we've talked through doesn't just disappear. The questions don't just go away. And the problems in this case don't suddenly resolve themselves just because a legal threshold is or isn't met. Post-conviction court answers legal questions. It doesn't answer the truth questions. And those are the ones that have kept this case unsettled from the very beginning. There's something else that I want to talk about here because I think it matters. And it's one of the reasons I feel as strongly as I do about this case. I want to be very clear about where I stand. I do believe that the wrong men are in prison. Now, that does not mean that I can tell you exactly who did this. It could have been Terry Britt. The evidence points in that direction more than it points anywhere else, but I don't know that. What I do feel certain about is this. It was not Zach Adams and his friends. And one of the reasons I feel that way comes straight from someone who was inside the investigation early on. Former TBI agent Terry Dicus. During his testimony, Dicus did not mince words. He referred to Zach Adams, Jason Autry, Shane Austin, and Dylan Adams as idiots. That was his word, not mine. At one point, when he was asked about investigating Zach's girlfriend and that whole group, he said he realized he was wasting his time investigating them. When pressed on who he meant, he clarified very plainly that he was talking about Zach, Autry, Austin, and Dylan. And his explanation matters. Dicus said the only reason that he kept chasing them at all was because they wouldn't shut up. They kept making stupid threats, running their mouths, saying things like, quote, "I'm going to put her in a well," or "her head's in a freezer." Not because there was evidence, but because they were trying to sound tough, puffing themselves up. Dicus described it as chasing noise, not substance. And when he contrasted that behavior with the crime itself, he testified that he did not believe this was an accidental encounter. He believed whoever abducted Holly put thought into it, planning, effort, timing. You don't just stumble into the woods at the exact right moment with the right positioning, gain control of a grown adult, move her cleanly, leave almost nothing behind, manage phones, routes, and silence, and then vanish. That takes forethought, restraint, control. And that's where this whole thing collapses for me, because the group the state convicted was not quiet. They weren't careful. They were not disciplined. They were chaotic, drug-fueled, impulsive, and loud. And here's where I want to be very careful, because this isn't about insulting anyone's intelligence. This is about capacity at the time. Meth doesn't just make people reckless. It specifically damages the parts of the brain responsible for planning, error checking, impulse control, and adapting when something goes wrong. Executive function. The stuff you need to pull off something like this without leaving a trail of contradictions behind you. People on meth often feel sharper, more focused, smarter. But in reality, their judgment is worse. Their ability to think several steps ahead is degraded. They overestimate their own cleverness while missing obvious risks. That combination leads to impulsive crimes, sloppy crimes, crimes that unravel quickly. It does not produce quiet, gap-free, well-timed abductions that withstand scrutiny for years. And that's before you even get to the cell phone data. Dicus later filed an affidavit saying the timeline described at trial wasn't just unlikely, it was impossible, literally requiring travel speeds over 1,200 miles an hour to make it work. So when I hear the state's theory, I don't just see evidentiary problems, I see behavioral mismatch. This crime was executed with a level of planning and control that does not align with the people convicted of it, especially given the condition they were in at the time. That doesn't mean they're worthless human beings. It doesn't mean they're incapable of anything. It means that this crime, this clean, controlled, disciplined abduction does not fit them. And when you combine that with the physical evidence issues, the eyewitness mismatch, the cell phone impossibilities, and the recanted testimony, I just can't make it make sense. Before I wrap this up, I want to slow things down for a minute and make sure something is really clear, because I know how episodes like this can get framed once they're out in the world. This episode is not me declaring anyone innocent. It's also not me accusing the Bobo family of wrongdoing, cover-ups, or bad intentions. I want to be very clear about that. The Bobo family lost their daughter, their sister. Full stop. Nothing I've said here changes that. And nothing that I'm talking about is meant to shift blame onto them. I'm also not claiming to know what happened to Holly Bobo. I don't know who took her. I don't know exactly how it unfolded. And I don't know how this is going to end in court. What I am saying, and what I'm very comfortable saying, is that the story the jury was asked to accept simply does not hold together. Nothing I've said here proves what happened, but it does show what couldn't have happened, and that distinction matters. This isn't about rewriting history or picking a side. It's about evidence integrity, about whether the explanation we were given actually fits the physical data, the timelines, the behavior, and the people involved. That's it. That's the lane that I'm staying in. One thing I think a lot of people struggle with, and I get why, is separating legal outcomes from truth. We're trained to believe that if a court affirms a conviction, that means the case makes sense, that the evidence is solid, that the right call was made. But that's not really how courts work, especially at the post-conviction stage. Post-conviction review is incredibly narrow. Judges aren't retrying the case. They're not asking, did this actually happen the way that the state said it did? They're asking things like, was the defense constitutionally adequate? Were the rules followed? Did any errors rise to a level that legally requires relief? That's a very different question than, is this the right story? So if this petition gets denied, that does not mean that the evidence suddenly lines up. It doesn't mean the timeline becomes possible. It doesn't mean the cell phone data changes. And on the flip side, if a new trial is granted, that does not automatically mean that Zach Adams is innocent. It means the process failed somewhere important enough to reopen the door. Courts rule on procedure, not truth, in the philosophical sense. And I think that's important to say out loud now before a ruling comes down, because whatever happens, people are going to read a lot into it. There's another question that always comes up with cases like this, even if people don't say it out loud. If all this is true, how did it ever get this far? And I don't think the answer is one single thing. Part of it is community pressure. This was a small, tight-knit area dealing with a freaking nightmare. People wanted answers, closure, someone held accountable. Part of it is reliance on cooperating witnesses. Once you build a case around insiders who are cutting deals, the story starts to move forward on momentum instead of on proof. Every new piece gets interpreted through the same lens. And then there's narrative momentum. Once a theory is publicly presented, especially one as graphic and emotionally charged as this, it becomes very hard to unwind. Not because people are evil, but because reopening it means reopening wounds, admitting uncertainty, letting the ground shift again. That doesn't excuse mistakes, but it does explain how they persist. Cases don't always collapse when they should. Sometimes they harden. I'll be honest with you. The thing that bothers me most about this case isn't any single piece of evidence. It's the way nothing lines up cleanly, no matter how you turn it. I don't know exactly what happened to Holly Bobo. I wish to hell that I did. But what I do know is that when I lay the evidence out, the cell data, the timelines, the eyewitness description, the behavior of the people involved, the story that we were told just doesn't settle. It never has. And that's why I keep coming back to this case. Not because I think I have the answer, but because I don't think that we were given an honest one. The video work that I'm doing isn't about proving anything. It's about seeing it, watching how these things move through space and time instead of just hearing them described, because some problems don't reveal themselves in words alone. That's really the difference between this episode and the video work that I'm doing. This episode is about thinking through the problems. The videos are about showing them. Each one focuses on a single issue, the phone data, the routes, the timelines, and it lays it out visually, step by step, so that you can see why certain things just don't work. No hype, no conclusions handed to you. Just here's what the data does, here's where it goes, here's what it doesn't do. If you're someone who needs to see how things move through space to really understand them, that's what those are for. So that's where this leaves us. A case that began with a young woman being taken from her home, moves through years of investigation, arrest, trials, and appeals, and now sits in this quiet, uneasy space where the evidence has been re-examined and all anyone can do is wait for a ruling. I don't know how the Bobo family feels about the ideas that I've talked through in this episode, especially the possibility that someone other than the men convicted may have taken Holly from them. And I want to be clear about something. Every show on the Dark Dialogue Podcast Network centers on victims and their families. Distilled is no different. That will never change. Holly Bobo was taken from her family in a violent and horrifying way, and nothing that I've said here diminishes that loss. But I also have a personal commitment and a responsibility to honesty and integrity. As important as it is to center victims and respect their families, innocent men in prison is something that we cannot accept as a society. We just can't. Two things can be true at the same time. We can hold space for victims and their families and refuse to look away when evidence points towards a wrongful conviction. And I want to be very clear about something else. I am not saying that Zach Adams or his so-called A-team were good people. By most accounts, they weren't. They were drug users, drug dealers, criminals, people making terrible decisions, especially in the depths of addiction. Jason Autry is back in prison now on federal firearms convictions that he pled guilty to in 2022. I don't pretend to know who Zach or Dylan would be today if they were released. They might turn their lives around, but they might not. But that's not the standard. We do not lock people up for what they might do. We lock people up for what the evidence proves they did. And here's the reality that cannot be overstated or ignored. If I'm right, if the wrong men are in prison for this crime, then that means the real killer is walking free. That means Holly has not received justice. Her family has not received justice. And as serious as that is, there's something even more troubling. This was not a one-off crime. Abductions like this, controlled, planned, executed with restraint, are not accidents. They are not spontaneous acts of chaos. Whoever did this very likely has done it before or will do it again, which means that while we're telling ourselves that this case is closed, other women like Holly, are at a very real and nearly inevitable risk of suffering the same fate. As a society, we have a tremendous responsibility to victims and their families to pursue real justice, not just a verdict, to the accused to make damn sure that we're not punishing the wrong people, and to the public to protect others from crimes like this by holding the right person accountable. Those responsibilities don't compete with each other. They reinforce each other. And when a case requires us to overlook this many inconsistencies, this many impossibilities, and this many contradictions just to keep the story intact, the problem usually isn't the questions being asked. It's the answer we were given. Whatever Judge Bradbury decides, that ruling won't change the evidence. It won't change the phone records. It won't change the routes, the timelines, or the math. It will decide a legal outcome. It will not decide the truth. This episode wasn't about reaching a verdict or predicting how this will end. It was about slowing down, taking a hard look, and being honest about what doesn't hold up. For me, it doesn't. That's why I'm continuing the work on the video series. Not to prove anything, not to convince anyone, but to actually show these problems in a way that words alone cannot always do. Piece by piece, route by route, without forcing it to fit. As always, I appreciate you sitting with me through this. These aren't easy conversations, but they're necessary ones. And for now, all any of us can do is wait and keep paying attention. If you want to take action beyond listening, there are several ways to get involved. The Dark Dialogue Collective is our boots-on-the-ground volunteer group. This is not a donation tier. The collective is based on action, physical searches, direct victim and family support, and hands-on assistance where it's needed most. You can also get involved through our Adopt a Victim program. You can find information about both of those at www.darkdialogue.com. This program focuses exclusively on unsolved cases. Participants help research cases, work to identify unidentified victims, identify offenders in unresolved cases, or assist with both. We also publish ongoing victim blog posts at www.darkdialogue.com, preserving victim stories and documenting cases so that they are not forgotten. If you'd like to support the show financially, you can do so through Patreon for recurring support at patreon.com/darkdialoguepod, or through Ko-fi for one-time support at ko-fi.com/darkdialogue. You can subscribe to long-form writing and case updates on Substack at darkdialoguecrime.substack.com. If you have information, questions, or would like to get involved, you can reach us directly at info@darkdialogue.com. The Dark Dialogue Podcast Network includes Rocky Mountain Reckoning, the Dark Dialogue Main Show, Unraveled Truth, Gallows and Gunfights, and Shadow Chat Sessions. If you found this episode valuable, please like, share, leave a review, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. It helps more than you know. It's easy to get distracted by narratives, noise, and conclusions drawn too quickly. Once it's been distilled, the truth is what remains.